What does it mean to live a good life? My guest today, Massimo Pigliucci, has contemplated that very question. He joined me on the podcast to discuss his career, first as an evolutionary biologist, and later how he became one of the leading voices in modern Stoicism. We discuss everything from evolutionary biology, the quest for a good life, and some practical tips on how to live one. You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. When you hear the word philosophy, you might picture dusty books, ancient names, or abstract ideas far removed from our daily life. But what if philosophy wasn't just about the past, but instead was a way of having a living practice, a guide for how to navigate the challenges we have today? Recently, Stoicism has been undergoing a revival, with philosophers teaching its principles as tools for emotional balance and resilience in an ever-changing world. My guest today, Massimo Pigliucci, has built his life at the crossroads of science and philosophy. Trained as an evolutionary biologist, he went on to become one of the most well-known voices in modern Stoicism, bringing timeless ideas into conversation. He's the author of many books, including How to Be a Stoic, The Quest for Character, and How to Live a Good Life. He also hosted the popular podcast Stoic Meditations, where he made ancient wisdom accessible to thousands of listeners. I'm thrilled to have him here, especially because I knew him back at Stony Brook when I was a PhD student. We explore his journey from biology to philosophy, how the two disciplines inform one another, and why philosophy is still so relevant in our society, and what it means to live a good life. So settle in, this is going to be a thoughtful and hopefully inspiring conversation. Massimo, it is such a pleasure to have you here. I actually got to know you through your book, Denying Evolution, Creationism, Scientism, and the Nature of Science, things we're still sort of battling with today. And then, you joined the Ecology and Evolution Department at Stony Brook, which is where our paths crossed. And this was kind of my first experience in meeting someone who moved between, what I might say the disciplines of science and philosophy. And so I really love for listeners to get a sense of my guests. And I was wondering if you could start by sharing a little bit about your journey and how evolutionary biology and philosophy came together for you.
Yeah, according to family lore, about which I don't really remember anything because I was too little, I decided to become a scientist when I was a few years old. And in fact, on a particular night in July 1969, when the Apollo landed on the moon. Apparently, I just announced that night that I was going to become a scientist. Of course, it was going to be an astronomer, not a biologist. But then later on, I actually started studying science and all that sort of stuff. So in high school, I decided, it's going to be biology. But in high school, I also had, in Italy, when I was growing up in Rome, I also had a wonderful teacher of philosophy for 3 years. She really made the whole field come alive. In fact, she got me this close from switching in college from biology to philosophy, but I stuck with biology. And, as you know, I pursued an academic career in that field, did pretty well for 20 plus years. And then, of course, midlife crisis struck. So I was kind of, some personal things happened, some also at a professional level, things were going well. In fact, I was at Stony Brook. The crisis started before I got to Stony Brook. And I started thinking, okay, well, this is great, but do I want to keep doing the same things more or less for another, 20, 30 years, whatever it is? Now, this is not unusual. A lot of academics go through this kind of situation, right? Yeah. So at some point you figure, okay, I'm a full professor, I'm doing well, the research is going well, the grants are coming in. But now the only thing that was different in my case was that typically people take a sabbatical and look around in nearby fields. So they recharge their batteries for a year, they learn some new technique, maybe they switch field just a little bit, from, let's say, evolutionary biology to ecology or to molecular ecology or something like that. What was different was, in my case, I looked pretty far afield. And that was by chance, because in that period, I met a very young philosopher of science, Jonathan Kaplan, who had just defended his dissertation at Stanford. And it turns out that his dissertation was on what philosophers call nature-nurture issues, that is, gene-environment interactions, which, as you know, was what I was studying at the time from a biological perspective. So Jonathan had actually looked at some of my publications. He had cited them in his dissertation. So when he came on campus, he looked me up. We met for coffee. We hit it off immediately very well. We became kind of instant friends. And one thing that led to another. And at some point I thought, philosophy, I have had this philosophy bug in the back of my mind for a while. And so I asked Jonathan if he was willing to be my mentor in going back to study philosophy at a graduate level. And I remember his first response was, how many glasses of wine did you have today? Because, he was an assistant professor pre-tenure. I was a full professor with tenure. It was definitely an unusual request on my part. But then I pointed out to him that I usually don't drink wine at lunch. And so so he agreed, and we did this really weird thing where for 3 years I was running the lab in the morning and early afternoon, and then going across campus and taking philosophy classes. But it was a lot of fun. It worked, and so eventually I found myself switching full time. It took a few years, but I found myself switching full time to philosophy of science, which is what I still do now.
There's so many parts to what you've just shared that struck me. One, it was having this certainty when you were young, then kind of having this questioning come in a little bit later, and sticking with evolutionary biology. I remember you worked on Arabidopsis, right?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Which, for listeners, it's a plant, and it's one of those, I always forget the official term, but like a signature species, right? That we use to have
it's a model system. Yes.
Model
that's right.
system. That's it.
That's right.
Followed by crisis, followed by rebirth again, and returning back to something that had captured you. And what I love about that is I think that my experience is many people that I encounter, we encounter students all the time. They want this straight path, this straight trajectory. And I feel like historically there was always value in having knowledge or acquiring knowledge from different disciplines, and how that informs or fuels creativity, even if you choose to stay in your same, kind of career choice. But, you've had such a unique career, kind of moving from evolutionary biology into philosophy, writing now, right? You have many books, so I didn't I will list them all, but you have many, many books, and also podcasting, bringing philosophy and science, I would imagine, is part of that too, to a broader audience. And so, looking back, does this now feel like a natural progression for you, or has it felt like one leap kind of after another that at the time might have seemed disjointed, but now feels more cohesive?
Well, we're good as human beings at rationalizing things. So after the fact, it looks like a perfectly natural progression, right? I don't think it was at the time, but it wasn't either a sort of random jumping around. As I said, there were clear precedents. There was a clear interest that I've always had, not only in science in general, but also in more conceptual aspects of science. Even as a biologist, yes, I was doing research, as you pointed out, on Arabidopsis and other species. So this was empirical research, but I was also always interested in the nature of scientific theorizing, the nature and evolution of evolutionary theory, that sort of stuff. And so when you're interested in that sort of things, then the step from science to philosophy is not as big as it might appear at first sight. So, at the end of the day, we only have one life, at least so I believe. And so, at some point when you want to explore new things, if you have the opportunity, if you're lucky enough, as I was, to have the opportunity, you might as well take it and figure out how to proceed in a way that it's satisfying first and foremost for you, because an academic career, you don't get into an academic career to make money or to become famous. Some people make money and become famous, but it's very rare. You get into it because you have a passion. And so if you're not passionate anymore, if you're not interested in what you're doing, then what the heck are you doing? You're just wasting your time. And right. So, I think that kind of occasional stopping and rethinking the whole thing and say, okay, does this still work for me, or should I go in some other direction? I think it's relatively healthy.
Yeah. Has it ever been scary? And have you experienced, I want to use the word maybe resistance from fellow academics in your, evolutionary biology kind of circle? It's a small world, right?
Yes.
Smaller than we think. And, have you ever experienced that kind of resistance? And was there anything that was scary for you about shifting or integrating something so seemingly new, but not necessarily for you, into your career and your life?
That's a very good question. Yes, there were some interesting situations. I'll tell you about it in a minute. But the thing is, what saved me, I think, is that, like many academics, I have a fairly large ego. And so it's like, when I'm convinced that something is the right way to go, I'll do it no matter what other people tell me, which of course is a dangerous thing to do. Sometimes it doesn't actually work out, but in this case it did. Yeah. So in the case of switching from biology to philosophy, I naively thought, when I was planning on doing it and working on doing it, that, my new colleagues in philosophy are going to look at me and say, hey, this guy isn't just a scientist who plays at being a philosopher, at the end of his career, like a lot of people do. He actually did the work of going back to graduate school, getting a PhD, blah, 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 writing a dissertation, etc. And I thought, and my old colleagues in biology would say, hey, we know Massimo, he's one of ours, and, he has a reputation, etc. Except that the reality has been largely that I am too much of a scientist for the philosophers and too much of a philosopher for the scientists, right?
Yeah.
And as I said, however, likely for me, I just don't care. I have fun doing what I've been doing in my new career, which I started relatively late for an academic. I've been reasonably successful. I published on some of the major journals in philosophy of science. As you pointed out, I wrote a number of books in the field. So it worked out. And, was it perfect? No, of course not. But life doesn't fit any kind of sort of perfect scheme anyway.
It's funny. I'm now going, wow, maybe I must have a very large ego, because I just agreed with almost everything that you said. So when you fall between the stools, I have, I write about, I talk about, I think about how our similarities more often than our differences with other species when it comes to sort of how we make a living and our relationships and our movement in the world. And oftentimes I'm asked, well, you're anthropomorphizing. And I say, well, actually, I'm zoomorphizing people. I'm not really anthropomorphizing animals.
That's right. You flip the coin around.
Pretty much. And I started kind of thinking about and doing science communication before it was like a popular thing to do. Now it's very popular. Yeah. And, and it was not well received. I was actually told by someone, well, congratulations on switching careers. And I was really confused. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, now you don't do science anymore. You just talk about science.
Yeah.
And I had someone else, when I wrote the first book in 2014, literally say, who do you think you are? You're not supposed to write a popular science book until you've achieved a senior status in the field. And I was like, That must be a miserable way to live and think about what you're allowed to do. Like, I'm just going to do what I do. I don't
Yeah.
really think about what other people are thinking about what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's right. I was told essentially the same kind of things when I was working on my first book, on technical book, on with Carl Schlichting, who was my advisor at the University of Connecticut in biology. I was told very clearly, since I was on a tenure track position, he said, you're shooting yourself in the foot to write a book now, and you should be getting grants funded and doing your research. And I thought, and why are these two things mutually exclusive? Why can't I do both?
Well, right. And if that's the case, then I'm missing both feet because I shot them off with 2 books. Okay. Well, as fun as that is, I kind of, I'm thinking about, like, maybe this is a little overly simplistic, but I often think about how evolution gives us these, incredible kind of whys and hows, stories of survival and adaptation. And you've also studied how species adapt and change. How has your background in evolutionary biology influenced the way you approach philosophical questions?
Well, one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, that I'm too much of a scientist for my new colleagues in philosophy, they're not that new anymore because I've been doing this for a number of years at this point. But it's precisely the fact that I always bring up the point of view of a scientist and say, okay, but let's look at the evidence. What does the empirical evidence say about this thing? And the joke in my department in philosophy is that the way to end a conversation among philosophers is to say, well, that's an empirical question. And that's it. You're done. Then you're not doing philosophy anymore. It is a joke because fortunately, even philosophers are in fact increasingly recognizing that there is no fundamental distinction really between science and philosophy. Historically, if you think about it this way, historically, the sciences have come about as a series of spin-offs from philosophy, right? And early on in the history of philosophy, there was no difference between science and philosophy. The pre-Socratics were the ones that arguably invented science because they moved away from mythological explanations and they started looking at the natural world. That's step number one. Step number two, also taken by the pre-Socratics, was the recognition that sometimes your reasoning abilities will transcend what your senses tell you immediately. And you might want to go with your reasoning instead of your senses. That is, you want to discard the appearance of things and actually go deeper. That's also a fundamental, building block of science. Aristotle was doing science. He wrote books about physics. He wrote books about biology. He was in the field on the island of Lesbos doing research on mollusks and fish and stuff like that. So science is a very old thing. It used to be called natural philosophy. Then what happened? In the beginning with the 17th century, early 17th century, we have what we now call the scientific revolution. Well, the scientific revolution arguably can be reasonably described as a series of spinning off episodes where new disciplines became independent from natural philosophy. The first one was physics, Galileo and Newton. Then we got chemistry, Boyle. Then we got biology, Darwin. Then we got psychology, James. So on the span of like 3 or 4 centuries, what happened was that the new disciplines became so specialized and so independent in terms of methodologies, questions, and so on and so forth that people were not doing philosophy anymore. But think about it this way. Up until Darwin included, what we today call scientists call themselves philosophers. Mm-hmm. The word scientist was actually invented by William Whewell, who was one of Darwin's mentors. So it's that late. It's mid-19th century. Before that, there was nobody referred to themselves as scientists. So if you look at it this way, it's a natural progression. The origin of the sciences is the result of a natural progression, which doesn't bring about any kind of sharp distinction between what was there before and what is here now. The perception that we have of a sharp distinction is actually an artifice of the 20th century. especially after World War II, because after World War II, both science and philosophy, as well as other academic fields, became highly specialized. It wasn't the case anymore that you could be the gentleman naturalist as Darwin was. You had to have academic credentials. You have to do spend a lifetime in a university. You have to publish or perish. All that sort of stuff. That is what very rapidly separated science from philosophy from other fields. And in fact, even the sciences themselves. I mean, it used to be the case that there was no fundamental difference between a physicist and a biologist. Today, not only there are differences between physicists and biologists, but even within physics and biology, right? If you're evolutionary biology, usually you don't do a lot of other things in biology. If you're a physicist that works on quantum mechanics, usually don't work on anything else. So all of this is perhaps inevitable because the specialization in academic fields has meant that these fields, are making progress. If you don't work on very narrow, very specialized aspects of certain questions, you're not making progress because a lot of people before you have already done all the easy stuff, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean that conceptually there are these major gulfs and separations between the sciences themselves or the sciences and are at least parts of the humanities, such as philosophy. And I would say even history. I mean, history is an empirical discipline. It's not, evolutionary biology is a partially historical discipline. Paleontology is an entirely historical discipline. Astronomy is an entirely historical discipline. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because I have studied different species and I started on prairie dogs, then I had some lemurs and now mountain gorillas and which is wonderful and incredible. But I remember trying to write a paper about sea turtles and boy, the sea turtle people were not happy with me. Right. I don't know anything because I didn't study sea turtles it's the one paper I've never been able to publish. It's amazing.
Wow.
And, but I was also sort of felt that pressure, our E&E department at Stony Brook, it was sort of that traditional, very siloed, even though we had, some of the leaders in ecology and evolution and that founded that department, I felt this pressure that, okay, you either study the same question forever or you study different questions in the same species forever.
That's right. Exactly.
And I do none of that. I'm all over the place. And then people it's kind of worked against me in the sense that, you don't have a cohesive sort of research program. And it's like, no, I do. It makes sense to me, That's right. Because I'm led over here like, ooh, that's nice. Let me look at that for a while, and I'm always thinking about the connection between us and, what we might call the natural world. And I'm always trying to share that these early naturalists were also artists and philosophers and diplomats and theologians and right. So this idea that we had to do one thing, I mean, I think it's affected all of us, regardless of your career, that you do that one thing for a very long time. And that's what you do. But I've always thought about this relationship and, I'm curious, how do you think philosophy impacted the way that we view other species and our place in the tree of life, for lack of a better description? How did those early philosophers shape how we saw ourselves in relationship to other animals?
That relationship between ourselves and other animal species has, of course, changed over time and across cultures. I mean, we're talking mostly about Western philosophy, but that's not the only player, of course, historically speaking. And in a sense, it has been perhaps predictably a constant back and forth, right? So you look at, I don't know, Aristotle again, and how he looked at animals. I mean, he clearly made a distinction between other animal species and humans. He famously referred to human beings as the political animal and the rational animal, right? Mm-hmm. But you also find bits in Aristotle where he literally says, it's wonderful to study even the smallest possible creatures. You cannot avoid a sense of awe and admiration for the way these things work and are put together. So you can see even more than 2000 years ago, 2400 years ago, this negotiating the perceived exceptionalism of human beings on the one hand, and the recognition, even way before evolutionary biology was a thing, that but there is a kinship here. There's something here going on. And we're not talking just with other primates, but with life in general. So proto-evolutionary ideas have been around since the pre-Socratics. We need to be careful not to impute modern ideas, of course, to the ancients, because even the most classic example, like the Epicureans who went around espousing an atomist philosophy, and people often say, "Oh, they anticipated quantum mechanics." No, they didn't. This has got nothing to do with quantum mechanics. But they did anticipate some important insight, which is, for instance, the notion that the world at bottom is made of small things that interact in ways that are completely different from the way in which visible things, macroscopic objects interact. The notion that the bewildering variety of things that we see in the world is actually the result of a small number of basic components that are reorganized, in different, infinitely different ways. Those are fundamental ideas. The fact that they got the details wrong, it's neither surprising nor, frankly, particularly interesting. We probably also are getting a lot of the details wrong, and scientists in a century or two or 500 years down the road, assuming, of course, that we manage to survive that long, given the current trends, will think differently and say, look at those people in the 21st century. They were really seriously mistaken about this or that or the other. But that isn't the point. The point is we have had certain insights that have shaped the entire way in which we're thinking about both our role in the cosmos, such as it is, and our relationship with other species in ways that are surprising, even if you go back millennia. All right. I just was reading a book that I'm reviewing recently. It's a collection of essays about animals by people like Plutarch and Aristotle and so on and so forth. So these are people who go back more than 2,000 years. And some of what they say, it's kind of fantastic. I mean, Plutarch attributes to elephants, for instance, behaviors that very likely they were not there. It was more imagination than empirical evidence. But it also clearly shows how these people actually were affected by observing the behavior of animals, were prompted to think about the relationship between themselves and these animals. So there's the influence has gone both ways. I think the empirical science obviously influences the philosophy, because after all, philosophy is essentially about thinking through the implications of our understanding of the world or our observations of the world. And vice versa, this thinking has also directed the way we actually investigate the world, right? So the priorities that we have, the way we look at problems, what kind of questions we think are important or not.
Okay. There's so much I want to say there. I might want to have a sit down. I wish I could have one now with Aristotle and maybe challenge the idea that we're the only political and rational. I might want to.
Oh, yeah.
I might want to question that one a little bit.
Yes.
But, it's so interesting what you just, I appreciate that you just defined philosophy. I really probably should have asked you that at the beginning. What is philosophy? But when I was listening to you say that, I thought to myself, well, I'm wondering whether other species, elephants, chimpanzees, prairie dogs, fish, have their own way of contemplating life and how they investigate life, how they make sense of their life, even if it's not in some structured sense, that we would call philosophy. So do you think that other animals have their own form of contemplation or making sense of their world that we might not be able to understand or that we even underestimate?
Possibly. I mean, the problem there is, of course, that we have it's a problem that philosophers have been dealing with a long time, which is the problem, so-called problem of other minds.
Yes.
Right. So the problem of other minds is bad enough when it comes to other human minds.
Yes.
And it's essentially next to impossible when it comes to other species. So the problem is, of course, I have some degree of access to my own inner thoughts. I say some degree because modern psychology shows that what we think we know about our own thinking processes is often biased and, superficial and so on and so forth. And we're talking about our own thinking processes, right? So we tend to rationalize our own motivations for doing things. So when somebody says, "Oh, I know my own thoughts," it's like, man, maybe you do, but not necessarily, right? Or I know why I'm doing this thing. Well, depends. It's difficult enough to know your own thoughts, which of course was the Socratic injunction: know yourself, right? That's what you found at the entrance of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. That the first injunction is know yourself. That is already difficult. Knowing other people, it's much more complicated because, of course, we don't have access to the minds of other people. We only have access to their behavior, including what they tell us about things. But, it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that one thing is what you tell me, another thing is what you think. They're not necessary. You cannot assume that they're the same thing. When it comes to other animals, we have no access at all to their inner processes for the simple reason that they don't talk, or at least they don't communicate in a way that we understand. Mm-hmm. Which means that it's, I think the reasonable answer to your question is I'm going to be agnostic. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, I would be stunned if the ability to reflect at some level or another on one's own existence and one's own place in the world were limited to only one species. Pretty much nothing we know of is limited to one species. Things happen in evolution, things happen by stages, gradually. Even when evolution is rapid, it's still one thing after another. It doesn't, you don't come out completely formed out of nowhere. That's the whole. That's a major insight of evolutionary biology ever since Darwin. That things don't come out of the blue with no antecedent, with nothing coming before then. So I would say my intuition is that there is going to be some kind of gradual progression. That is, if we go from human beings to other advanced social primates with relatively large brains, then the chances are pretty high that those animals have some kind of inner life that is at least reminiscent. As you say, they're not doing philosophy, they're not writing books about that stuff, but at least reminiscent of what human beings do. By analogy, I assume is going to be reasonable to think that something like that may be happening also in other large brain mammals. Let's say some dolphins, for instance, or elephants or things like that. Why? Well, because of the large brain stuff. Right. Large brains are complex, pieces of biomachinery, and we know that they're capable of doing these kind of things. The further you move from those levels, that is, the further you move from the only thing we really know anything about, which is the human approach to things and the human biology, then the more the question becomes, I don't know, right? Do I think that insects have an inner life like that? Probably not. on the basis just of the simplicity of their nervous system. Yeah. Well, where's the line? I don't know.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's an empirical question, and it's possible that it's the kind of empirical question that we might never be able to solve, because there may never be actually a way to say, this degree of complexity, but no less. There may even not be a degree of a specific threshold. It may be a gradual thing. Think about it this way: we're going to have soon the same problem with AI, right? The problem of other minds. I don't believe for a second. By the way, I should immediately add: I don't believe for a second that current AI, large language models and all this stuff, is anywhere near being, sort of conscious or capable of inner processes and stuff like that. I just don't believe it, because I don't think that's the right kind of architecture. But I can easily imagine how at some point in the future, somebody will produce an AI architecture for which it will make perfect sense to ask yourself, does it actually think? Does it actually feel something? Does it actually have an inner world? And how we're going to answer that question is entirely up in the air. I have no idea. I mean, people for a long time, as you know, I proposed something like the Turing test, but the Turing test is too easy. I mean, current AI can pass the Turing test very easily. You can have a conversation with current AI for hours, and never, it would never occur to you that it's not human unless you knew that that we're actually talking to ChatGPT. So that kind of test is too simplistic because it's a behaviorist test. It's only about an outward behavior. It's not about inner processing.
I love that, because that also brings to mind whatever species I'm studying, I can make some statement about what I think is going on in their mind. But actually, I also know I have absolutely no idea. I'm looking at behavior. I'm making interpretations about behavior without necessarily setting intention. And that's the same thing that we think about with people. People say, well, don't believe what someone says, pay attention to what they do. But what they do doesn't actually even inform you about what they're thinking. It's just about behavior.
Yeah.
And you can make interpretations about behavior, and that's about it. And so, I think, and the whole AI question is really interesting, because I maybe I'm mistaken for saying this, but it can evolve, correct? So evolution itself doesn't imply the sort of the inner life of consciousness, right?
That's right.
So
there has to be an advantage to be conscious, right? From an evolutionary perspective. And we don't necessarily know what that advantage is, by the way. There's lots of theories out there for why we developed consciousness, why even we developed that degree of intelligence that we have, because it seems like an overshoot. It seems like we are way too smart in terms of survival and reproduction. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm pretty sure that because the human brain actually is very costly from a metabolic perspective, that's got to be reasons why it evolved in a certain way. But as usual, the problem is it's hard to get the relevant data, because all of that evolution has happened, hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. We don't have enough data in terms of the ecology, in terms of the social, situations that may trigger certain steps in human evolution. So, you can speculate, but we don't really know for sure. But this notion that if it's biologically costly, it probably has a reason for being. Otherwise, natural selection would have been eliminating it or not even gotten there in the first place. I think it's a pretty sound assumption in terms of evolutionary biology. So the same then goes at some level or another for AI. Right now, AI is, it's a human construct. It's built in a certain way, which even human programmers don't understand very well, because the way in which the neural nets inside an AI actually work is essentially a black box. I mean, you can open it up and you can look at it, but you're not going to understand why those connections work in that way. We've known that for a while. I mean, people have been doing neural networks, studies in neural networks for decades. This is not a new thing. ChatGPT came out only a few years ago, but we've been doing research in that area for a long time. And it was very clear very early on research in neural networks that, yes, you can train a neural network for a certain task. You can give it a target, and the network does become better and better at identifying that, or relating in whatever way is desired to that target. But then you stop there and you say, okay, let me see how it does it. Let's open up the box, and you have no idea. You see a bunch of connections there that clearly do something. They do something functionally, it works, but it's too complicated. It's too nonlinear. There's too many connections, and so you cannot unravel it. You cannot reverse engineer it, because it's not a result of planned engineering. It's a result of essentially a process of natural selection.
Right. Yeah, which, brings us all the way back to that first book I remember reading of yours, Denying Evolution. Well, so something that you brought up, about how we contemplate and how we, think about and how we reason through looking at what is our life and what does it all mean. I feel like philosophy seems like something for a person of leisure.
Hmm.
Meaning, if you're running around trying to just survive, whether you're a gorilla or a person, the time to contemplate, like if you're too busy just getting through the day,
Yeah.
when do you have time to contemplate, right? I feel like philosophy was or is something that you have to have no pressing needs to run around and complete errands or rush the kids off to soccer practice or doom scroll or scroll forever on your phone now. Do you think that this perception comes from misunderstanding the nature of philosophy?
I mean, to some extent, you're right. There is any kind of intellectual activity, not just philosophy, right? Science included, requires leisure. It requires, I mean, we were talking about earlier about Darwin being a gentleman scholar. Well,
Right.
he could afford that because he had an income, right? He didn't have to work.
Yes.
And so he could afford to do that sort of stuff. And to some extent, that has been true ever since the pre-Socratics. I mean, there is a reason why Western philosophy arose in the 6th century BCE in Greece, because that was a society where, despite turmoils and wars and all that sort of stuff, there was in fact a surplus of resources. There was time and leisure for some people to be able to take that time aside and do things that were not immediately involved in survival. So I think that to some extent that is true. But there are two major caveats that I think it's worth at least thinking about. First of all, that this notion that we're busy, it's actually rather recent in the history of humanity, right? It's at least not earlier than the Neolithic Revolution. That is when we invented agriculture and started making large settlements. The estimate before, during the Pleistocene, is that most human beings actually had a lot of leisure time because it didn't require that much time to forage for food. You were doing that, and then for many hours during the day, you were just hanging around shooting the breeze. And so this notion that we don't have time because we're so pressed with things, especially in the 20th and 21st century, but even before, it's a rather recent thing. That's caveat number one. Caveat number two is, lucky for us, we have people who do it for a living, right? So one of the advantages, to some extent, of the Neolithic Revolution is that it created a stratification and division of labor. So it made it so that I don't have to spend all of my time foraging and hunting and all that, building my house and so on and so forth, because there are people who hunt for me, forage for me, and build houses for me. And that's why I can spend time reading books and writing, right? So today we have this situation, this advantageous situation where you don't have to, if you want to philosophize, that is, if you want to reflect on issues of meaning, priorities, values, and things like that, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to invent the wheel. You just go to the bookstore or the library and start picking up books. And so what you need is a few hours a day or even a few hours a week. And you can actually make a significant progress in that area. I mean, that's how I started philosophy. As a scientist, I was plenty busy doing science. But then, in the evening, during the weekends or whatever it is, you pick up the occasional book, or these days, of course, you can get lots of other resources on the internet, and start looking around. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's why there's actually an explosion. There's been an explosion of philosophy books for the general public. You were saying earlier that writing for the general public, for academics to write for the general public, is a rather new thing. And that is true if we're looking at the time between after World War II and now. That's new. But before that, it wasn't that new, right? The people were writing for a broader public. Aristotle was, all the way back to more than 2 millennia ago, he was writing a set of books for his own students, and then was writing a set of books for the general public already at the time. Right.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most famous philosophers in the history of philosophy. He was already aware of the fact that he had to write for a broader public, for a general public. And thankfully he did.
Yes.
Because now we have a lot of interesting stuff from that period that otherwise we wouldn't have.
Well, that's true. And so then let's bring that now to your books and your writing. I think you've shown that philosophy isn't something dusty and full of old men with beards, like for the past, right?
Yeah, I am an old man with beard, but yes, sure.
I didn't think that one through. Okay.
No, it's perfectly fine.
But
it is what it is.
So I feel like what you've done is make philosophy practical, for modern life. And one book that comes to mind, of course, is How to Be a Stoic, using ancient philosophy to live a modern life. And that's the book that prompted me to reach out to you, because someone I'm close to was playing the audio version in the car and said, "Oh, but I love Massimo Pigliucci. He's incredible. This is incredible." And I was like, I know him. And so sorry I didn't track your career. And wow. I was listening and I thought, oh, I would love to talk to him. So what does it mean to be a Stoic? And then what does it mean to be a Stoic today?
Yeah, very good questions. So again, we're back to the midlife crisis, right? So we talked about the sort of professional aspect, but at about the same time, a couple of things were happening in my personal life that kind of caught me off guard. A divorce that I wasn't expecting, my father dying, and a couple of other things that happened all about at the same time in a short period. Now, any psychologist would tell you that one of those things is stressful enough. If you get 3 or 4 happening essentially in the same year, then the stress is significant. Now, when this was happening, I thought, okay, what kind of resources do I have to deal with these kind of issues, which after all, plenty of other people have dealt with. I certainly was not the first nor the last person whose parents are dying, right? So how did other people do it? And I thought, okay, I left the Catholic Church when I was a teenager, so that's not an option. That's not a set of resources that I'm going to go back to. I consider myself ever since a secular humanist. And so I thought, well, then let me see what secular humanism has to say about this thing. And surprisingly, the answer was not much. Secular humanism is an interesting philosophy that still I am sympathetic to. It is about support for universal human rights. It's about support for evidence-based sort of living and science and reasoning and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't have a lot of practical tools. In fact, it has no practical tools. It's not the kind of thing that you can turn to and say, okay, now what do I do in practice? Forget, yes, it's great to be in favor of universal human rights, but what am I going to do today to deal with this particular problem that just hit me? So because I was studying philosophy professionally, I thought at the time for sort of professional reasons, and I thought, well, here you are, you're studying philosophy. It literally means love of wisdom. So something somewhere is got to be, there has to be some kind of answers that are useful. So I started a kind of a systematic approach where I read and practiced for some time Buddhism, because it is a very practical philosophy. I read Aristotle, who is very practical in his ethics. I read Epicurus, who is also very practical. And then very quickly I figured out that a reasonable answer, at least for me, because it varies for different people. It varies depending on your background and your culture, what you're used to and your way of thinking. But for me, I thought the answer is going to come from the broad area of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is what the Greco-Romans called their approach to studying meaning and goals and stuff like that. It's called virtue ethics because it's based on character. The notion is to improve your own character, that what you're supposed to be doing in life is not going around saying to other people, you're bad and you're good, or this action is good and this action is bad. You're supposed to improve your character, to work on your own way of being. So I thought, okay, great. But Aristotle, somehow interesting, but didn't click. Epicurus, interesting, didn't click. And so at one point, I was on Twitter, what at the time was called Twitter, and I saw this thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, oh, that's weird. What the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because I thought, of course, like most people, of the Stoics as Mr. Spock from Star Trek.
Right.
Stiff upper lip and suppression of emotions. Now, I love Spock, but I wouldn't want to live a life like he has, right? This is not my role model from a practical perspective. But then I thought, okay, hold on a second. Stoicism is in fact a type of virtue ethics, so it's in the general ballpark of what I was pursuing. I remember reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations in college, and he was a Stoic. Although at the time I didn't really make the connection, but it's like, okay, he was a Stoic. I also remember translating Seneca, another Stoic, as it turns out, from Latin when I was in high school, because I took several years of Latin. So we had to translate a number of authors, and Seneca was one of them. So I thought, okay, maybe there is something more to Stoicism than the stiff upper lip. So I signed up for this Stoic Week thing, which, by the way, it's still done every year. And now I'm on the organizing committee for Stoic Week and similar initiatives. But at the time, I thought, okay, let me try it out. So I downloaded the recommended reading material, and the very first thing that I read was a guy named Epictetus, who was a early 2nd century Stoic philosopher. He had a really interesting life. He started out as a slave, so at the bottom of Roman society, and then eventually, by midlife, he was the most revered teacher in the entire Mediterranean area. I mean, people were flocking to his school to listen to him talking. So I thought, okay, this guy's interesting. And I read Epictetus, and I almost literally heard the click at the back of my mind. Oh, this is somebody who makes sense. This is somebody who doesn't talk any nonsense. He's very straightforward. He tells his students what he thinks, and they're doing right or wrong. He has a sense of humor that kind of borders on sarcasm, which I appreciate. And so I started reading more and more of Epictetus, and I discovered that Stoicism does have a lot of tools, practical tools, that are actually useful for dealing with setbacks, crises, and things like that. And we know they're useful. We come back to the scientists. We know that they're useful because they're evidence-based. I didn't know this at the time, but in the 1960s, people started practicing a new type of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is these days now very well established. It's the most evidence-based type of psychotherapy. Nothing to do with Freud and Jung and all that sort of stuff. Well, it turns out that the first two people that started doing cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, were Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, both in New York. And both of them started out because they had read Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. So essentially, you can think of CBT as empirically based Stoicism for the 20th and 21st century. So it's very useful. And ever since, now it's been more than a decade that I've been practicing. There are a lot of techniques. There are different kinds of meditations. There are different kinds of things that you can do with Stoicism. They're very practical. But fundamentally, Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics, which means it's about improving yourself as a human being, as your character. Work on your character constantly. There are different ways the Stoics do that, but the most simple approach is they try to follow what are called the 4 cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues are wisdom, specifically something called practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Basically, the idea is that you ask yourself, whatever you're doing, whatever you're contemplating and doing, whatever decisions you have to make, you ask yourself, well, is this wise, courageous, temperate, and just? And if the answer is no to any of those, you just don't do it. You just refrain. right? So it becomes a compass for the ethical life. You have four. That's why they're called the cardinal virtues, like the cardinal points. They are points of reference, so that you keep them constantly on your mind. You train yourself to constantly ask yourself, well, am I doing well by these standards? And if the answer is yes, keep going. If the answer is no, then you need to stop, pause, and re-examine things. And it has worked very well for me.
Well, and it also feels like it has a way of distilling down your ability to make decisions, right? Because sometimes we get stuck in ruminating all kinds of things that don't have anything to do with the decision at hand. But that leads kind of to the other book, The Quest for Character. And I know we've been on a long time, and I am so grateful for all your time. And I just, I'm almost to the end. But The Quest for Character, it was centered on how to live a good life. And we could probably talk for an entire other hour about what does it mean to live a good life and what is it that we're pursuing, right? But I think that, I'd like to sort of ask if there were one or two practical lessons that listeners could carry into their daily life, other than asking these four, starting with these cardinal questions or cardinal virtues. What would it be? Where's a good place for someone who has no experience and no background to start?
There are two suggestions that I can make because I think that in my experience, they work very well. But let me first take a few seconds to answer your implied first question, which is, well, what does it mean to live an ethical life? The Stoics had a very clear answer. They thought that a good life is a life, as they put it, lived according to nature. Now, to live according to nature for the Stoics, that doesn't mean necessarily, going naked into the forest and hug trees, although there's nothing wrong with that. But they asked themselves the following question. So let me do it by way of an analogy. Let's say that you invite me over for dinner and I bring you, the customary bottle of wine, but I also bring you a present, a cactus plant, right? Because I like cactus. I think you like plants, so I'm bringing you a cactus plant. Now you're responsible for the cactus. It's your cactus, right? You have to know something about cactus nature. Otherwise, it's not going to flourish. Potentially, it's going to die. If you think, for instance, it's a plant, so it needs a lot of water and a lot of light, you're going to kill it. Because yes, it's a plant, but it's a desert plant. It needs a lot of light, but not a lot of water. If you flood it, you're going to just rot the roots. So in order for the cactus to flourish, something has to be known and implemented about cactus nature. The Stoics thought the same goes for human beings. We're a little bit more complicated than cacti, but fundamentally, there is a human nature. That is, human beings are a particular kind of animal. And if you understand what kind of animal human beings are, then right there, nature gives you a lot of hints about what makes that kind of animal flourish. Of course, we need to take care of basic needs, right? Shelter, food, water, that sort of stuff. But what about beyond that? What is it that is specifically human? And according to the Stoics, two things are specifically human, not necessarily exclusively human, but certainly characteristic of the human species. We are pro-social, we are cooperative, we're highly social animals, and we're at least capable of reason. We may not be rational animals like Aristotle said, but we are capable of it. And so for the Stoics, a good human life means a life where you cultivate reason, you use not just theoretical reason, but you use reason in order to solve your problems. And you do that cooperatively with other people because we are intelligent social animals. So we thrive, we do well when we work together with others and we use our brains, our large brains, in order to solve problems. And that strikes me as fundamentally correct. You can quibble on the details and you can say, well, but other species, it's fine, whatever, it doesn't matter. I think that is a fundamentally good insight into the human existence. Now, you asked about specific practical things. I think there are two that I would suggest. One is what is called the evening meditation or philosophical journaling. This is essentially what Marcus Aurelius was doing in his meditations. Marcus Aurelius' meditations were not meant for publication. It was his own personal philosophical journal of reflection. So it works like this. And this is, by the way, a practice that is definitely backed up by modern cognitive behavioral therapy, meaning it works. Ideally, every night, or at least several times a week, take a few minutes. It doesn't, you don't need an hour or half a day, just a few minutes. Collect your thoughts, in a quiet environment, if possible, and then write down the answers to these three questions. What did I do wrong today? What did I do right? And what could I have done better? The notion is, the answer to the first question, what did I do wrong? It's not because you want to beat yourself up and all that sort of stuff. When you've done, it's done. It's done. It's past. You can't change it. But you want to learn, presumably, from your mistakes, right? So writing them down helps you fixing them in your mind and paying attention to them as opposed to just sweeping them under the carpet. Similarly, answering the question of, what did I do right? It's because you want to pay attention to the kind of things you've done right, because those are the kinds of things you want to do more of, right? So you need to pay attention to both of those things, when you went wrong and when you went right. I think the most important question is the third one, however. What could I do better the next time? Because a lot of situations do repeat themselves more or less in our lives. Like, for instance, let's say that, today I got angry with a colleague because I got upset and all that sort of started yelling or whatever it is. Well, something like that will happen again. Either the same colleague or somebody else or a friend or family member, somebody will upset you at some point about something. So it will happen again. And reflecting and writing down what might have been a better strategy and better way to respond to that kind of situation makes your mind better prepared for the next time that happens. So the first technique is the evening meditation or the philosophical journaling. The second one, which I found literally life-changing once I started adopting it, comes from the same guy that I mentioned earlier, Epictetus. One of his two books, the Enchiridion, which means manual, starts out with the phrase, some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And then he lists the kind of things that are up to us and the kind of things that are not up to us and what kind of attitude is useful. And in Epictetus's mind, the useful attitude is focus your attention on the things that are up to you, where your agency is efficacious, where you can actually do stuff, and work toward an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the kinds of things that you cannot do anything about, or they're outside of your agency. I apply that now to pretty much everything. Let me give you just one small example. As you know, I travel quite a bit for work and mostly for work. So of course, from time to time, it happens that I go to the airport and the flight is canceled. Now, I see a lot of people getting really upset and start yelling at the poor employee, the airline employee who can't do anything about it anyway. And in fact, he wished that you were on the plane on your way out because he doesn't want to deal with it. So instead, I started, whenever something like a challenge or potential setback comes up, I start asking myself exactly the same question that Epictetus poses. Well, what here about this specific situation is up to me and what is not up to me? Well, what is not up to me is to make magically the plane appear and the flight being on time. That's not up to me. So forget about it. This is not the kind of thing that you should waste an ounce of emotional resource because it's not going to happen. What is up to me, however, for instance, is to get out my smartphone, get on the airline's app and book myself the next flight available, and trying to do that before everybody else who yells and is upset about it does it, so that I have a good choice of flights and seats and all that sort of stuff. Once I've done that, I had just to wait for 3 hours, let's say. Okay, so I can head to the nearest bar, help myself to a nice glass of wine, open a book, and start reading and catch up with my readings or with my emails or whatever it is. In other words, this approach does two things. Number one, it immediately redirects your attention toward the kinds of things you can actually actively do. That means you're in control. that means you feel better immediately because you're doing something about the situation that is actually useful. And the other thing that it does is over time, that takes more experience and practice. But over time, you do develop this attitude of equanimity. You say, well, you know what? I know that flights are the kind of things that can be canceled. And it's not personal. It's not about me. It's not that the universe is, going after me. It's just this is the nature of these kinds of things. Flights get delayed. And if you expect flights never to be delayed just because you are the one that gets to the airport, then you're an idiot. Then you're a fool. Right. And since you don't want to think of yourself as a fool or an idiot, just accept it. This is the nature of reality. And it behooves us as human beings to accept reality as it is and then trying to do something about it. This is not a counseling for quietism or for, being a doormat or anything like that. This is a counseling for action, but action where it's possible and where it counts, not imaginary actions that are actually not doing anything.
Yeah. Well, you just answered one of my questions, which is which books could I start reading other than yours? Because I think I need that manual. I do pretty well on the, traffic and the things that I see disturb many people.
Yep.
And I wonder why, because your disturbance does nothing to alter the situation. And yet I fail consistently to apply that same reasoning to other people's behavior.
Yeah.
That's where I trip up quite a lot.
Yeah, I know. We all do. But Epictetus does actually address that specifically with his students. He says, if you expect other people to behave the way you want them to behave, then you apparently don't understand what people means, what the word people means. These are other minds. They're not under your control. You don't control what other people do. You barely control what you do. So get better at that.
And stop worrying about
exactly.
And then either your interactions with other people will improve or you will move away from much faster people and their behaviors that are disturbing.
Yeah. Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations has a wonderful phrase about exactly this kind of thing. And remember, he was the emperor.
Okay.
He had a lot more power than your average person about making other people do what he wanted, right? Nevertheless, apparently he was just as frustrated as the rest of us about other people's behavior. And so at one point he says to himself, he's like, oh, so they're not doing what you think they should be doing. Well, you have two options. Number one, you teach them. You explain to them, like, look, this would be a good way to do things. And number two, you have the resource of patience. You say you accept that some people are just going to do stupid things, no matter how well you explain it to them. That's their business.
Yeah.
The important thing is that you don't do the stupid things as well, because that's your business.
Yeah. Or they're going to do the mean things, or the
mean thing. That's right.
Whatever they're doing. Often now, this is the other thing. Maybe it's in these philosophies is that it's rarely about you in the first place. What other people are doing. Because if we think about what I'm doing, how much of what I'm doing is really about other people.
Yeah. And we tend to be pretty self-centered. So it's usually about us.
Well, exactly. We package it as if it's for us.
Oh, yeah. Of course.
But I do want to acknowledge you have been so generous with your time. And so my last question will be kind of what's coming up for you next? Like, what are the ideas and projects that you're now the most excited to explore and share with us?
Well, I just finished a book that is coming out next year for Penguin, and it's about Cicero. Cicero was a really interesting individual. He lived at the end of the Roman Republic. He was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and people like that. And he was an extraordinary person. He was a philosopher. He was a public advocate, a lawyer. He was a statesman. He became at some point consul of the Roman Republic, which means essentially president with full powers. So he had an incredible life. And the book explores the intersection between his life and his philosophy. So we know a lot about his philosophy, not only because he wrote some of the most important books from antiquity, but also because we have a lot of letters that he wrote to his friends. So we've kind of a behind the scene, to some extent, access to what he was thinking and how he was feeling about certain situations. So I'm trying to propose Cicero as a really interesting model of just how complicated and yet possible, challenging, I should say, and then possible it is, however, to live a philosophical life. He did. He failed in certain respects. He was, picking himself up and trying to do better, that sort of stuff, which is what we all do. But it's a really great example of how one can live or try to live by certain standards, by certain goals, by certain overarching, sort of way of looking at things, and still be a human being. Which means failing and then starting over, and then failing again, and then starting over, and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm involved mostly now. When finishing up the Cicero book, and we'll see what it goes. And then, of course, professionally, I now switched almost entirely to the demarcation problem in philosophy of science. So that's the distinction between science and pseudoscience. And that's because, as you might have heard, pseudoscience is now the official modus operandi of the US government. So there's a lot to do there.
Yeah. Well, I will say you have not only inspired me to go deeper into understanding philosophy and thinking about how to apply it in a practical way. I don't know if I'll ever get another PhD, but, I don't know. Are you taking students? I'm just curious.
I am taking students, but no, you don't need another PhD. You just need, to pursue your things and read your things and then figuring out what you want to do.
Well, we'll see. I might circle back with you on that.
Sure.
But for now, where can people keep up with you or catch up with you? And I'll list all your books in the show notes and provide links. But do you have a website?
Yeah, most of what I do is available on Substack, in fact. So if you go on the whole shebang, every, the books, the essays, writing, and also podcasting and everything. So on Substack, I am at Figs in Winter.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Which we'll talk about at some other time. It's actually a title that comes from one of Epictetus's metaphors. Okay. He was saying, don't hope for figs in winter, that is, for figs in outside of season, and instead enjoy the figs when it's the right season, the summer.
Wow. And I think that's wonderful to end on that. Thank you so much, Massimo, for being on the show. It's really been a pleasure reconnecting with you and talking with you.
It has been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Listening to Massimo, I learned that Stoicism was never meant to be an abstract philosophy. It was designed as a guide for living. At its core are the 4 practical virtues: wisdom, knowing what truly matters, or we could think of it as discernment; courage, acting well in the face of uncertainty; justice, recognizing our obligation to others; and temperance, which is really about finding balance. Together, these virtues offer a framework not for controlling the world, but for responding to it and developing ourselves. If you'd like to go deeper into Massimo's work, be sure to check out the show notes for links to his books, his Substack, and other ways to keep up with his latest writing and thinking. His work is really an invitation to ask better questions and learn how to live with intention and purpose. Next week, we'll take these ideas into a new special series on love and relationships, exploring how connection, cooperation, and care shape both human lives and non-human lives. We'll begin with Robin Dunbar, whose work helps ground ideas on love and belonging in our evolutionary history, our need for social bonding, and that pro-social nature that Massimo talked about. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the podcast, follow it, and share it with someone who might also enjoy the conversation. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To keep up with new episodes, essays, and behind-the-scenes reflections, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.jenniferverdelin.com or visit my YouTube channel, Wild Connection. You can also follow along on my Substack, Wild Connection at Real Dr. Jen. This is where I share essays, field notes, and behind-the-scenes thinking from the podcast. Thanks for listening, thanks for thinking with us, and remember, stay curious.